Anyway, so today we are on is it our fourth? Yeah, this is the fourth week of the Got Questions study. And this week we're talking about the heretical gospels and the not apocalyptic, the apocryphal writings and the Dead Sea Scrolls. And this was Marley's question. So I'm glad that Marley is here today, because I do have some additional information that I want to share with you guys. So first of all, I do want to kind of, I guess I should maybe apologize in advance. I know I tried to pack an awful lot of information into Sunday's sermon. But the question was kind of broad.
It was.
And I didn't have enough weeks to divide it up into two. So because I've got another really good question about gematria, which is the use of numerology in the scriptures, and I wanted to be able to answer that. And then we have one more Sunday where we're just going to kind of throw all the rest of the questions in. And try to address each one, which there's only, I think, maybe 3 or 4 left for that last Sunday. But so I apologize in advance for throwing a whole lot of information at you guys. But hopefully today we'll have an opportunity to, maybe go back and answer some of the questions that might have popped up during Sunday's sermon. And then I also have a couple of videos that I'd like to show today. And also I have some other books that y'all can, I just thought I would share with you. And if you want, I can put them together into a book list that you might want to take a look at if the subject really is of interest to you. I found that the last week that I was preparing for this sermon really fascinating, because while I was exposed to these writings, during seminary, we never dug really deep into them. And of course, the deeper you dig, the more you want to find out and the more interesting it becomes. And hopefully the videos that I picked out for you today will kind of pique your interest a little bit. And and then you might want to even just do a little bit of diving on your own and see what you come up with. So, okay.
Well, I really liked your sermon and learned a lot from it. So I thought that was good.
Good. Well, and I really didn't think it was going to end up being as long and as involved as it turned out to be, but like I said, the more you dig into it, the more you learn. And when Marley posed the question, it was, what are the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Gnostic Gospels and all the other writings have to do with? It's like, well, now that's kind of a big pot, isn't it?
Yes, it is. Yeah, it is.
So we kind of started out with the talking about the other writings, what's considered apocryphal, or actually you really kind of start out with biblical versus not biblical, or canonical versus non-canonical. Some people call them extra biblical. It's different terminologies used by different people, but they basically fall into those two categories, which are the apocryphal, which are writings that basically didn't make the cut, and then you've got the in addition to the apocryphal, you've got the pseudepigrapha, and the pseudepigraphal was kind of an interesting group, because what I found really interesting during my research into this was that at the time that the canon was being established, the overall belief system was that the names of the people on the books were the people who actually wrote the books. So Matthew actually wrote Matthew, and Mark actually wrote Mark, and Luke actually wrote Luke, and and so on and so forth. Well, now we're not so sure. And since that time, of course, since the early centuries when all of these books were being passed around and all these writings were being combined into something that looked like the canon, since that time we have learned that some of the books that were attributed to Paul, and you can go back and look at your old Bibles and it'll say the epistle of St. Paul to thus and such, or the epistle of St. Paul to the Thessalonians, or to to Timothy, or to the Corinthians, or to the Romans. And they, what we've learned though since is that not all of those that say the epistle of St. Paul to were actually written by Paul. So there are some books in the Bible that it is believed were not written by Paul at all, but were considered pseudepigrapha. And I remember when I was in seminary and I first heard the word pseudepigrapha, and I thought, well, that sounds a lot like either forgery or, it's got this kind of questionable quality to it. But then what I learned in my New Testament class was, no, that wasn't the case at all. That it was probably, they could have been written by a student or a disciple of Paul. And when the student or the disciple of Paul was writing these things, he probably believed that what he was writing was what Paul would be saying. And so it was a matter of what's the word I'm looking for? It was like a tribute to Paul, like saying, okay, I'm writing this writing and I'm going to put Paul's name on it. And it's not that I'm trying to impersonate him, but I'm trying to acknowledge him and pay tribute to him because he was such a great figure within the Christian movement. So
it's kind of like the old masters, the artists, who oftentimes their apprentices would work on paintings and fill in things, and sometimes something that was attributed to one artist may not have actually been his because an apprentice did it.
Exactly, that's exactly true. And so when these Gnostic Gospels were discovered, and when other writings that were considered pseudepigrapha were discovered, what the early church fathers and the early church scholars, if you will, people like Josephus and Irenaeus and other men like that, they could not determine who the person was that wrote it. And so even though it may have had Peter's name or Thomas's name or somebody else's name on it, they could not, or they did not want to attribute it to that particular person. And so they said, well, we don't know who the author is, and so we're not going to discount. We're going to discount this and set it aside, and we're not going to put it in the canon. Okay. And there's one.
The pseudepigrapha, is the first of it from the root of pseudo?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So one of the videos that I have talks about this and talks about how the canon kind of came to be. And I think it's the one that that deals with the Dead Sea Scrolls. I think that's the one. So I've got 3 videos that I want to show you guys. So you've got those, but you've got those writings, and then you've got the Gnostic Gospels, which were found in the 1940s. And of course, many of those are considered pseudepigrapha. Many of them are considered heretical, because anything that did not fit into the Orthodox belief system at the time, and we're talking in the 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th century, maybe even into the Middle Ages. If a scripture or if a work, if a writing did not fit the Orthodox norms, the Orthodox belief system, didn't matter who wrote it, it was considered heretical. And so that's why a lot of the Gnostic Gospels are considered heretical, because they belong to this belief system, which later became known as Gnostic or Gnosticism, and is Gnostic, which believes, has this really interesting belief system in that the body is dirty and evil and ugly, but the soul and the spirit is clean and pure. And of course, the goal is to ultimately leave the body and become one with God. But there's also this sense of, but we're also still one with God, even though we're living in these ugly, dirty, awful bodies, right? And their understanding of Jesus, particularly of Jesus's resurrection, was much more spiritual as opposed to physical. And that just did not fit in with the Orthodox belief system. And so the Orthodox said, nope, these are heresy. These should not be looked at. They should not be, we just need to put them away, and not read them at all, because they do not fit in with the belief system that we have established as Orthodox. Okay. Kind of like, and what it reminded me of is that kind of like nowadays, for a different purpose and a different reason, there are certain fictional books that are no longer being read in schools, right? Books like Huckleberry Finn, books like The Scarlet Letter. There's another one by Hawthorne that I can't remember. I don't remember which one it is, but there are historically wonderful books of fiction, which when I was going to school back in the Dark Ages were considered classics, right? They were classics. And now they're not able to be read because of various depictions of Blacks, the treatment of certain genders and races and all for different kinds of reasons like that. So it almost reminded me of that the early church fathers and the early church hierarchy, if you will, basically was saying these books are, they don't fit into our box. And they don't fit into the box that we put God in. And so we're going to dismiss them as heresy, and we are no longer we're not even going to talk about them.
We can't allow critical thinking. We just have to tell people what they need to believe.
That's right. That's right.
I
And see, back in the day, many, hundreds and thousand years ago, when the only people who were able to read were priests, that worked, right? Because you didn't have people that were really critically thinking about or critically diving into the scriptures, because they didn't know how to read them. They depended upon the priests to not only spoon feed them their Bibles, the text from the Bible, but also their theology, what it was they were supposed to believe. And that's why when the Bible was finally, when Martin Luther translated the Bible from Latin into German, and the German people could now read it. And Tinsdale took the Latin Bible and started to and worked to translate it into English so that the English speaking people could read it. That's when things started to change. Interestingly, Tinsdale was put to death and his Bibles were burned because the priests did not want the people to have the text to be able to think for themselves.
So I understand having, seeing whether a book fit in your current theology or the theology of the time. What I don't understand is how they determine inspired by God. What exactly does that mean? It seems very, I don't know.
So the first video that I think I want to show you, the one on the Dead Sea Scrolls, and I'm not going to show you the whole thing because it's a 90-minute video. I'm going to show you about maybe the first 10 minutes of it. It's a really interesting documentary, and I encourage you to pull it up. And in fact, I'll go ahead and add it to the chat as well. But he talks a little bit about that. He talks, well, not so much about the inspiration, but a lot of it had to do with whether or not the writing itself indicated, that it was inspired by God. So, for example, I want to say the Isaiah scrolls, the book of Isaiah, I think starts out, the word of God given to the prophet Isaiah. Now, what's interesting is that there are multiple Isaiahs who are quoted in the book of Isaiah, but that's a whole nother topic. But that's really what they depended upon, was did the writer say, I'm particularly the prophets, that it was something that was inspired.
Okay.
Yeah. Now, what's interesting too, and I think one of these videos touches upon this too, is that, we think of the canon as having been established at a certain date, but that's not really completely accurate. It's really more that the canon was developed over time as the people in religious authority were putting together these lists of writings, even going back to the time of the early church, back into the first, second, and not so much the first century, but well, yeah, the first century, first, second, third centuries. They were compiling lists to and sending them out to the churches and saying, these are the writings that you can quote from, and these are the writings you need to be teaching your people. And then gradually over time, those lists started to grow and grow and grow, and finally somebody said, hey, this is getting out of control. We need to figure out a way to limit this. And then that's when they started canonizing the different testaments for us, particularly the New Testament. Right. And they finally get to the point where they agreed on these. For the New Testament, they agreed on the 27 books. Old Testament, still was under dispute because you've got those 7 books of the Apocrypha, plus there's even additional Old Testament books that didn't even make it into the Apocrypha. So there's just this huge amount of literature that was being written at the time. And one of the things that I meant to say in my sermon, and I forgot to put it in, and I forgot to even say it when I was preaching it, is that as Christians, I would hope that particularly as 21st century Christians, that we would be able to be entrusted to read these writings and to use the brains that God gave us to discern what is real, what is is theological and what is just absolute Fruit Loops, out of the box nonsense, right? There's one set of Gospels called the Infancy Gospels, and I think I've shared those with you maybe before, where there's one that tells different stories about Jesus when he was a child. And some of them are just so absurd. And I read through these things and I think, okay, you know what these things tell me? Whether the things that he did were really happened or not, what they tell me is that Jesus was a normal kid. He got himself into trouble from time to time. I have this one book called The Complete Gospels. And it includes not only the canonical Gospels, but a lot of the other Gospels that are out there, including the Infancy Gospels. And let me see if I can find it real quick. Okay, so here's I, Thomas the Israelite, am reporting to you, all my non-Jewish brothers and sisters, to make known the extraordinary childhood deeds of our Lord Jesus Christ, what he did after his birth in my region. This is how it all started. When this boy Jesus was 5 years old, he was playing at the ford of a rushing stream. He was collecting the flowing water into ponds and made the water instantly pure. He did this with a single command. He then made soft clay and shaped it into 12 sparrows. He did this on the Sabbath day, and many other boys were playing with him. But when a Jew saw what Jesus was doing while playing on the Sabbath day, he immediately went off and told Joseph, Jesus' father, "See here, your boy is at the ford and has taken mud and fashioned 12 birds with it, and so has violated the Sabbath." So Joseph went there, and as soon as he spotted him, he shouted, "Why are you doing what's not permitted on the Sabbath?" But Jesus simply clapped his hands and shouted to the sparrows, "Be off, fly away, and remember me, you who are now alive." And the sparrows took off and flew away noisily. The Jews watched with amazement, then left the scene to report to their leaders what they had seen Jesus doing. So, here he is. He's a little boy. He's 5 years old, and he's playing in the stream. And he gets in trouble, and he says, "Okay," and he claps his hands, and the birds fly away. I mean, it's just remarkable little stories like that. And it's like, okay, we can believe that he did something like that, or if we can believe that Jesus healed a blind man of his sight, or healed a paraplegic, or rose someone from the dead, why is it so far-fetched that we wouldn't believe that he fashioned some birds out of clay and then gave them life and made them fly away? Why couldn't we believe that? Not that we necessarily would or wouldn't, but why couldn't we? So, I love the Infancy Gospels. I just think they're so much fun to listen to. But anyway, let's check in first and see if there are any questions that you guys have. And then, by the way, welcome, Judy. Thank you for joining us. So glad that you could be here with us today.
Crying, I finally got there.
Yeah.
Unusual. It's not unusual.
Sometimes this Zoom stuff
I
is
do
hit and
have a
miss.
sideline.
Yeah. Go ahead.
I love to listen to this stuff. I love to read it. And a bunch of years ago, I did a couple of years of pretty serious studying about a whole lot of things I didn't know, even though I've been forever in the church since a little girl. So the question came up. We were sitting with our kids and at lunch, and the question came up, do you believe that Christians have to go to church? Because it got onto where do you go and why do you go?
Yeah.
And it's the same question that has always sometimes bothered me when someone says, can you be a Christian without reading the Bible? And there was a time where I wouldn't have known where I was at enough to answer that. And I did answer it, which was comfortable with me and with them, evidently. But when we go through this, like people can be so, this is right and this isn't right, like reading with the Gospels. The judgment calls, I don't know, I wish it was all standard so that you didn't have to think.
Yeah.
Now you have to think, and why do I believe? And the song, why me, Lord? Why do I spend time doing this? And not everybody does. And I watch their lives and they seem to be as Christian oriented and as secure in their faith as anything, but they never turn a page of the Bible. They get it on Sunday or from some other place, mostly on Sundays, I think.
Mm-hmm.
So when you dig into things like you're digging into right now, how important is it in your mind that is that part of growing, or is part of growing becoming more Christ-like with those you do touch in those specific healings or something?
Right, right. Well, I have some opinions here, but I'm going to ask Dana and Marley, what do you guys think about in answer to Judy's question?
I think people have given their lives so that if we don't have the Bible to read and other sources, then we're just believing in what the church says or whatever the leaders are. And part of my relationship with God is to be able to question things and be able to say, man, is this right? And make decisions on my own, which is, I think, a blessing.
Okay. Marley?
I would say I think it's very difficult to make a very strict distinction of is someone not Christian. I mean, for some people, yes, but to me, Christianity and faith is a journey, and it's learning and growing, and so people are at many different places along the path, along that path, and to me, what we get out of moving along that path is what benefits us and what we can get more and more out of our faith.
Right.
Moving along that path, but it doesn't necessarily distinguish whether somebody's Christian or not.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm like you, Judy. It would be nice if
church.
Yeah, it would be nice if everything was really cut and dried, right? If you go to church, you're a Christian. If you don't go to church, then you're not. If you go to temple, then you're a Jew. If you don't go to temple, then you're not. You know, it'd be really nice if that were the case, but it's not, you know, because I think you've got these different layers. I kind of agree with Marley. I think that, well, you have those people who say they believe in Christ, they live a Christ-like life, but they've never set foot in a church, and they have no desire to set foot in a church, probably because the church has given Christianity a really bad name. The church has over centuries has persecuted, has just think about the way that during the times of slavery that the church treated people who were Black. Same thing with people who are gay today. The church is the way that women have been treated. I mean, there are so many reasons why people will not become a part of the church or will choose not to set foot in the church, but yet maybe they were raised by Christian parents, and so and maybe they went to Sunday school, but they don't go anymore. That's kind of the case for us. Our son, we dragged our kids to church every Sunday. Unless they were sick, they were going to church. And so we dragged them through, and they went through confirmation and all of it. And there was a point in time when my son, when he became about 19 or 20, when he said, you know what, Mom, I don't believe in God anymore. I just can't believe it. And he started quoting me all these different verses in the Bible, and I started, quoting different or sharing with him some of my thoughts about the Bible, and he kind of, went, but he's always been very supportive of me and my ministry and my desire to become clergy, and he's always been very supportive of that. And we can have family dinners and pray, and we can have, sometimes we have family dinners where we don't pray, and it's all okay. But what I do know is that, there may come a point when he will change his mind about that. But I also believe in my heart that when my son dies, when he reaches the end of his life, and he comes face to face with God, that God will be able to look into his heart and see that he is a good person, and see that he lived a Christ-like life. And I believe that very strongly, because that's the way my son lives his life. Even though he says he does not believe in God, he says he does not believe in Jesus, he says he's never going to go to a church ever again. So what do we do with that? We love them, right? We love people like that. And we just show them how much we love them by showing the love of Christ toward them. I also agree with what Marley said, and with what Dana said too, in that we can go through life just showing up on Sunday mornings, getting our Jesus on, going home and living our lives the rest of the week, and then getting up on Sunday mornings and doing it all again. And we can call ourselves Christians.
Yeah.
I would argue that doesn't necessarily make you a Christian. What it makes you is a person who goes to church. And there are a lot of good reasons to go to church. You learn a lot in church. You make new friends in church. You have community and support. We have one family right now who both the husband and the wife are going through some really significant medical issues. They love the fact that they're getting phone calls from people. They love the fact that they're getting cards from people from the church. They love the fact that they're getting prayer shawls from the church. They just are so glad that they have this community of people who care about them. And that's one of the benefits of being a part of the church. Do you have to go to church in order to be a Christian? No. It sure helps. Do you have to read the Bible in order to be a Christian? No. You could sit in the pews on Sunday mornings and just listen to what's being, spoon-fed out to you. But what I try to do is try to challenge people. There are some pastors who will say, okay, here's the passage and here's what it means. What I like to try to do is say, here's the passage and here's what I think it means. Now you think about it. The last week's sermon, I talked about the Gnostic Gospels. Some people say they're heresy. Some people don't. I want you to look at it for yourself. I want you to figure it out for yourself. And that's where we grow in our faith. That's where we become, I think, more spiritual, more connected to God, more connected to each other. You get out of it what you put into it, right?
Exactly.
And if you just show up on Sunday mornings, get your Jesus on, and then go home or even go out into the parking lot and yell at the people in the parking lot because they're blocking you from getting out of your parking space. What kind of a Christian is that, right? So I don't know if that helps at all, Judy, but
Yeah, it does. It's just, I think in my own life, I don't know what I would have said 20 years ago to the question at the table. But now
me too.
there must be some kind of benefit in continuing this learning, because there were things that came to mind immediately that I could say earnestly because they wanted to know.
Yeah.
Meaning it. We don't go. Why do you have to go? And then at the end, I remember one of the kids saying, yeah, and we all come to the way we are differently. Yeah. Because if I was going to pick out of our family somebody who exemplifies Christ, it's Dominic. He never talks about it, but his life is like that.
Mhm.
And it makes interconnection with families kind of fun.
Yeah.
And if you're open enough to say, I don't always know if I know there are any answers, and say that, it seems like sometimes, especially with my nieces, I want to hear something, but maybe you struggle just like I do to understand this. And
Right.
that's comforting because we all don't have all the answers.
Exactly. And what's marvelous right now is that we have so many resources at our fingertips. Most of the information that I put together in the sermon on Sunday came off the internet. You know, some of it came from a book that I'm reading right now, from Elaine Pagels called the Gnostic Gospels. But a lot of it just came out from articles on the internet. And, you know, do I know for sure that all of the ones that I quoted are absolutely correct and accurate? No, I don't. But they made sense to me. And so that's why I put them out there for you all. You know, and my hope is that some people in the congregation will listen to the sermon and go, wait, that sentence that Jody said doesn't make sense to me. I want to learn more about that. And maybe they'll go out and grab it off the internet.
The other thing that I think is happening more and more in churches is you just don't, and because I have a musical background, and that's important to me when I worship. When you go and it's not just your sermon, but it's all the links to it. The videos fit in, the music fits in. Sunday, I dang near sat and cried it's Carrie, right? When she sang.
Yeah.
Oh my God. And I just got a shiver, just like I did, because it seemed like her whole belief system came out in the way she sang that song. And I am such a believer in that. Oh boy, that was just beautiful.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's something that is very important to me as a musician as well. Making sure that not just making sure that the music and the liturgy and everything kind of fits together so that it's all aimed towards this one thing that we're talking about. Of course, this Sunday was hard because you don't have very many hymns that have to do with the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Gnostic Gospels, right? And so I thought, okay, well, we're talking about the Word of God, so we're going to put the Word of God out there. So Word of God Speak is one of my favorite songs, my absolute favorite songs. And that's the one that Carrie sang. It's just, she did it just so beautifully. She always does. I just love what she does. But then the other two hymns had to do with, you know, Lord, speak to me that I may speak. You know, speak to me through the words, and not necessarily just the words from the Bible, but any words that we happen to read. And like I said, I've got a few books that I'll show you here in just a moment. But let's transition over to the Dead Sea Scrolls because they're a little different. Well, no, let's do that later. I'm gonna show you. Sorry, my brain is going in multiple different ways. What I'd like to show you first is something about the Gnostic Gospels, since we've been talking about that.
Jody, one question that really, for me, that kind of drove the question that I asked is, and I know this is not a simple question either, but how much, because you've alluded to this some, how much are the other writings supportive of what is in the canon versus something totally different? Does that question make sense?
Yeah, it does. So there's a lot actually that is supportive. There's, in fact, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, much of what they have been able to piece together of the Dead Sea Scrolls is or are the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament books. So there are copies of copies that were used by the Essenes as part of their worship. And they were also, I think that they were kind of like a group of monk-like people who Part of their job might have been just to, copy
Yeah.
all of these things and send them off to different places. But they maintained this remarkable library, which ultimately became what we know of as the Dead Sea Scrolls. And what is remarkable about them is that they are supportive of they're very close to word for word, although I don't think they were written in Coptic. I think they were written in Aramaic, which would have been kind of the normal language that people would have spoken. Now, as far as like what percentage would have been supportive, I don't really know. There are, for instance, the Gospel of Thomas, which is a sayings gospel. There have been scholars who have compared the sayings in that gospel to what's in the 4 canonical gospels, and they are very close or even sometimes identical. So, which begs the question, was that a source for Matthew, Mark, and Luke? There's something called the synoptic question. I think it's called the synoptic question, where they've tried to determine and discern which sources were used for the canonical gospels. And so it's believed that Mark was the first one that was written and was probably used as a source for Matthew and Luke. And then there's some source material that is unique just to Matthew. There's some source material that is unique just to Luke. And then they've been able to piece together some that's common to all of them, that they call the source Q. And there's a great book on that. This is it. It's called The Lost Gospel Q. It's called Q because the Q stands for not QAnon, but it stands for.
I was going to say, as long as it's not QAnon. Yeah.
No, it's Quelle, which is a German word, Quelle. It's a German word which means source. So this is one of the sources, and this was actually a gospel that was put together after the fact. So they took a bunch of sayings and they from those gospels and then just put them back together again into this Q gospel. Well, was there actually a document that looked like this back in the 1st century? No, but there were probably maybe many places where they happened to get their source material from. So it's really kind of an interesting study of that. So, all right, I'm going to go ahead and restart this video for us because I'm running out of time and I really want you guys to see these. It's really cool.
The Nag Hammadi Library, super illegal Gnostic Gospels or not? The discovery of the Nag Hammadi Library revolutionized our understanding of early Christianity. It's a collection of 52 Christian texts that definitely don't look like the type of books you'd find in your local Christian bookstore today. The collection includes so-called Gnostic Gospels, like the Gospel of Thomas and the Gospel of Philip, as well as obscure mystical texts with fancy names like the Trimorphic Protonoia. How did these books end up buried in a jar in the sands of Egypt? Some say it's because of the age-old battle of orthodoxy versus heresy. Prominent scholars of Gnosticism, such as Elaine Pagels, argue this was a stash of banned documents, an illegal library of books buried by monks trying to avoid an orthodox crackdown on heretical texts. Scholars in recent years have questioned this theory, though, saying that these books were not all that fringe, and in fact, they might have been part of a private collection of someone with an eclectic taste in Christian mysticism. Rather than a hidden stash of suppressed books, they may have been grave goods, some sort of books of the dead, buried to help shepherd the collector into the afterlife. But who's correct? Let's get into the evidence. In 367 CE, the Bishop of Alexandria, Athanasius, published a letter blasting people for reading heretical texts. He published his own list of sanctioned books instead, which happened to be our earliest list of the exact same 27 books that appear in modern New Testaments. The Nag Hammadi codices date to about the same time period as Athanasius. Scholars know this because the covers of the book were made by layering scraps of papyrus, and whoever made these codices grabbed whatever scraps they could: business contracts, receipts, lists of names, and 3 scraps of papyrus that have dates from the 340s CE on them. So the theory goes that whoever owned these Gnostic codices was trying to clear out their library of condemned books to conform to Athanasius's decree, and possibly to try to save the books for posterity. Prominent scholars such as James Robinson and Elaine Pagels support this theory. Now, we can't prove this for certain, but it's possible that these books came from a monastery based on a few threads of circumstantial evidence. Number 1, they were found only 3 miles away from a monastery founded by the monk Saint Pachomius. Number 2, they were found near tombs that we know Christian monks were living in, or at least visited, based on Christian graffiti on the walls of these tombs. Number 3, rather than Greek, the books are all written in Coptic, the language of most monks in Egypt at the time. And number 4, going back to those scraps of papyrus forming the book covers, some of these scraps were correspondences between monks. Monks were known to have engaged in industrial activity, so it's very plausible that monks could have bound their own books using scraps of papyrus from their own trash pile in their monastery, which would have included business contracts and discarded letters. So these threads of evidence have led many to assume that these books originated from a Pachomian monastery. There's a whole book on the subject arguing for the monastic origins of the Nag Hammadi Library. You really should check it out. However, this entire theory has come under fire in recent years. In fact, some evidence points away from the Pachomian monk theory, arguing that these books were both not all that fringe and maybe not from a monastery in the first place. Number 1, Athanasius was not that strong. How powerful was Athanasius really? Did he really have the authority to launch a book-burning crusade against Gnostic texts? I think when reading about ancient Christian bishops, we're often influenced by the bishop of the medieval or modern period, a figure with considerable power and religious authority backed by the momentum of 2,000 years of tradition. Bishops in the ancient world were not powerful figures. Well, I'm not going to deny that they had no power, but that power had limits in a world where Christianity was still a new religion trying to find its footing in society. Now, I study ancient Christian magic, another type of text that Orthodox bishops would consider heretical. And let me tell you, everyone was doing magic back then, copying magical books, using magical amulets. The Coptic Egyptian bishop Shenute says that monks themselves were making magical amulets for their followers. No one was listening to the bishops telling them to stop. So when someone floats the idea that the Nag Hammadi books were hidden by a Gnostic minority being suppressed by the big bad Orthodox brute squad, I gotta ask, Athanasius and whose army? Seriously, how could he enforce this? In fact, the scholar of early Christianity, Nicola Denzi-Lewis, reminds us in a recent article that Athanasius was banished 5 times and his authority questioned numerous occasions. So rather than reading his letter of sanctioned books as a decree, let's interpret this in light of his banishments. Maybe we're witnessing the complaints of a single bishop that many people were ignoring. Also, where were these codices found? Critics of the Pachomian monk theory argue that we need to pay more attention to where these books were found. Our earliest stories of their discovery say that they were found in a tomb or a cemetery. Why are we assuming that they were hidden from Orthodox book burners when they were probably an example of the most common practice in the ancient world? Funerary deposits or grave goods, burying a loved one with some of their possessions, especially possessions worth a considerable amount of money like fancy mystical books. Nicola Denzi-Lewis is one of the strongest proponents of this theory. She argues that the genre of the Nag Hammadi Library points to funerary deposition as the most likely explanation for why they were buried. The Nag Hammadi texts are concerned with cosmology and eschatology, stories about the beginning and the end of the universe. Their genre kind of fit with books of the dead, books you'd want buried with you as you pass on to the next life. This was a known Egyptian practice, burying books of the dead in tombs with themes about the afterlife. Moreover, she argues that the evidence isn't good enough proving that these texts came from a monastery. Any trash pile in early Christian Egypt would have had the same sorts of texts that we find comprising the covers of these books. She argues that it's much more likely that some private individual with a particular interest in Gnosticism must have commissioned the books and buried them with him after he died. Here's my read on the situation. It's very possible that these books originated from a monastery. If you wanted a Coptic-speaking expert that could read and copy mystical Christian books, what better person than a monk? But I'm unconvinced by the argument that the Nag Hammadi Library was hidden during a crackdown from Athanasius on heretical books. We're too quick to think in terms of orthodoxy versus heresy for early Christianity. Guys like Athanasius were gatekeepers trying to define what is orthodoxy and what is heresy. But a lot of Christians, even literate Christian authorities like bishops and monks, weren't playing by the rules. Monks were writing magical texts. They were writing, copying, and reading Gnostic texts. I don't think that there's much reason to believe that the Nag Hammadi Library were fringe books. The very fact that Athanasius was so ticked off at fellow Christians for reading books like this might suggest how common these books were in the first place. I have more videos on the Nag Hammadi Library headed your way, and this video took me several days to make. It was a lot of fun, but there's no way that this can be sustainable without the 170 members of our Patreon community that you can see scrolling by my head right now. So if you'd like to see more from Religion for Breakfast, let's make that 171 people. Thank you so much for your continued support, and more Gnosticism videos headed your way. Thanks.
So I found his theory kind of interesting, you know, that maybe these were, maybe the texts that they found there. I found it really interesting, the difference in his opinion in terms of the origins of the library. He didn't talk a lot about how the library was actually discovered. What I found really interesting, though, and Elaine Pagels goes into this in her book called The Gnostic Gospels, and I'm actually listening to this book on Audible. But she describes in her, and I shared some of it in my sermon, but she shares how they were found and then what happened afterwards, which is just heartbreaking because, you know, the person who actually found them, you know, took them and threw them on the pile of straw that his mother used to light the fire for their oven. And then she, you know, part of it was the papyrus. And so she burned some of the papyrus, not knowing what they had. So, but this is a good book. And if you do audio books, it is available on Audible, and I'm really enjoying it, enjoying listening to it. But that's one of the videos that I wanted to share with you. The other one is by the same guy, only he doesn't have a beard in this next one. But he talks a little bit more about the Gnostic belief system. So I'm going to cue that one up here. Any questions about that first one? Nope. Okay. I will share all of these videos if you're, in case you're interested in going back and watching them again. So, all right. So this one is on what did Gnostic Christians believe?
For Christians, Gnosticism is the arch heresy of all heresies. It is an esoteric, mystical cult in opposition to a more authentic Orthodox Christianity. Traditional Christian scholars such as N.T. Wright think it is a particularly troubling heresy. Rather than believing in a bodily resurrection of the dead, or a Jesus that actually lived and died and rose again as a human, Gnostics, they say, are disgusted by the material world and see Jesus more as a spiritual being. The Gnostic conception of the afterlife, therefore, is an incorporeal existence away from this dirty and corrupted planet. Outside of Christianity, Gnostics sometimes are painted as countercultural mavericks fighting against stodgy Orthodox doctrine. Gnostics even made front-page news back in 2006 when the newly discovered Gospel of Judas was first published in English. Like other so-called Gnostic Gospels, the Gospel of Judas pays special attention to secret knowledge. Unlike the Gospels where Judas Iscariot betrays Jesus, in the Gospel of Judas, Jesus and Judas share a secret conversation away from the other disciples. Only Judas knows the secret mission of Jesus, and all his other disciples, you know, they're just deluded by a false god. But what really is Gnosticism when we cut through the hype from both sides of this discourse? And why has it played such a big deal in discussions of Christian orthodoxy and heresy to this day? Now, from the start, it is important to say that Gnosticism did not really exist. Well, By that I mean there wasn't a religion called Gnosticism in the same way that Christians and Jews called their religions Christianismos and Judaismos in antiquity. In other words, there was no church of Gnosticism. Of course, authors such as Plotinus and Irenaeus talk about people called Gnostics, or Gnostikoi for you Greek philologists out there. But Gnosticism as a term, as an ism, was invented by modern scholars to account for a family of writings, persons, and beliefs that all reflect a similar theme. So when we use the term Gnosticism, it is better to think of it as a school of thought, rather than a religion or a discrete, unified social group. So what did these Gnostikoi really think? Well, if you've watched any of my other videos, you won't be surprised to hear that it's complicated. You see, most of what we know about Gnostics comes from polemics, what we would call anti-Gnostic writings. It would sort of be like asking a Democrat to write an essay called "What is a Republican?" Rest assured, it would not be completely unbiased, with exaggerations and half-truths thrown in there throughout. So for example, a friendly neighborhood bishop by the name of Epiphanius of Salamis writes, "The Gnostics are a blasphemous assembly, full of enormous recklessness, and the filthy perversity of their beggarly obscenity truly pollutes the ears." Harsh words for sure, but he goes even further. According to Epiphanius, the Gnostics are a filthy and promiscuous bunch, holding orgies instead of church services, and eating babies instead of bread and wine for the Eucharist. And if you think eating babies can get even worse, it does. I'm just really interested in keeping this video blog PG-13. If you want the R-rated version, just go read Epiphanius. Okay, Epiphanius is an extreme example, but I hope it illustrates how difficult it is to reconstruct an ancient theology using writings written by guys that absolutely hated that theology. These accusations are obviously slander instead of a historical portrait of the ancient Gnostics. I don't really think they were eating babies. A better way to find out about the ancient Gnostics is to read their own texts. We have a large collection of Gnostic texts called the Nag Hammadi Library, a collection of Christian texts discovered in Egypt in the 1940s, making it one of the most important archaeological discoveries of all time, along with the Dead Sea Scrolls. Comparing the Nag Hammadi Library with the polemics of the Church Fathers, scholars have been able to reconstruct a stereotypical Gnostic theology, what I call a list of Gnostic cliches for reasons that I'll get into later. The first Gnostic cliche is that they believed in a dualistic anthropology. This means that they sharply delineated between the material body and the spiritual realm. They valued the soul as something transcendent and harmonious, trapped within a dirty, corrupted body. The ideal afterlife, therefore, is for the soul to escape from this body and enter the spiritual realm. Since this world is so messed up and corrupted, this means that it must have been created by a messed up and corrupted God. Therefore, the second Gnostic cliche is that they believed in a dualistic theology, one that states that there are two main gods. One higher, perfect God called the monad, and a lower, inferior, almost evil God called the demiurge, the one that created this material reality. The Nag Hammadi text called the Apocryphon of John is probably the best example of this dualistic theology. The Apocryphon of John reinterprets the creation myth that we find in the book of Genesis. Instead of God being the supreme being that creates Adam and Eve, he is a jealous and lesser God that traps humanity on a corrupted planet, hiding the keys to divine knowledge in the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Jesus in this reinterpretation is a savior sent from the monad to save humanity from the demiurge. He encourages Adam and Eve to eat the forbidden fruit to attain divine knowledge, and therefore eternal life. This leads into the final Gnostic cliche, a primacy for secret knowledge. This is what we talked about earlier with the Gospel of Judas, how only Judas had a special monopoly on the secret mission of Jesus that the rest of the disciples were ignorant about. The problem with defining Gnosticism as a typology, or as a list of characteristics, is that it emphasizes certain characteristics at the expense of others. So for example, how many Gnostic texts do you think match the typology that we just created? Dualistic anthropology, dualistic theology, and a primacy for secret knowledge. Let's take the Gospel of Thomas for an example, which is commonly understood as the most famous Gnostic gospel. We certainly see a concern for secret knowledge. The first line of the Gospel of Thomas reads, "These are the obscure sayings that the living Jesus uttered and which Thomas wrote down. And he said, 'Whoever finds the meaning of these sayings will not taste death.'" Eternal life itself depends on secret knowledge here. Other passages throughout the Gospel of Thomas talk about the individual embarking on a journey of inward truth. But does this concern alone warrant calling the Gospel of Thomas Gnostic? There is no wicked demiurge, there is no hatred of the material world. And if you start going through every text of the Nag Hammadi Library, you'll find that none of them quite fit this typology that we've created. The Gospel of Truth, for example, written by the arch-Gnostic Valentinus himself, has no wicked demiurge, it has practical moral values, and Valentinus talks about an earthly Jesus that actually died and rose again from the dead. Terribly earthly things to do for a theology that supposedly hates material existence. And this is why I use the term Gnostic cliches. They are stereotypes that are certainly evident in ancient Gnostic texts, but we should be careful not to think of Gnosticism as a set of beliefs with boundaries as rigid as these cliches. Some scholars want to throw out the term Gnosticism entirely, thinking it's just too blunt of a tool to do such precise historical work. The jury is still out on these debates, but if you're not a scholar, it's good enough to recognize that the Gnostics believed a variety of theologies that fall within one of the stereotypes that we just talked about. Of course, Epiphanius and Irenaeus never use a term quite as polite as variety. Instead, for these church fathers, Gnosticism represented a heresy. But why so much vitriol? And why does this matter for today? Heresy was viewed as dangerous or invited exile precisely because it involved outsiders trying to become insiders, or insiders that other insiders were trying to push out. This infighting exemplifies a phenomenon called the narcissism of small differences, an unnecessarily complicated term that means when closely related communities, whether religious, ethnic, or political, engage in near constant warfare because their small differences are more threatening than some distant foe. So for example, although Gnostic theology sounds kind of weird to modern Christians, Gnostic and Orthodox Christians have a lot more in common than, say, Christians and ancient Celts. Both Gnostic and Orthodox Christians affirm the existence of Jesus. They both think Jesus had some major role to play in world history and salvation, but their differences spark anger and suspicion, while their differences with ancient Celtic religions doesn't exactly spark a thriving genre of anti-Druid polemics. The point of all this is to show that you can't talk about Gnosticism without talking about heresy. The two are almost synonymous, both in antiquity and in Christian churches today. But this position doesn't exactly help when we are trying to place Gnosticism into its historical context. We're essentially siding with the baby-eating perspective of Epiphanius when we do. We can't exactly take orthodoxy for granted when we study ancient Christian texts, a time when the delineation between orthodoxy and heresy was a lot more fluid, and there was a surprising diversity of theology within Christianity itself. This concept of the narcissism of small differences, the idea that we fight our religious neighbors a lot harder than we fight anyone else, that concept is alive and well today. It not only can help us see what ancient Gnostics really were like 1500 years ago, but it also might help us cut through religious conflict today, recognizing slander when it happens, and achieving a more nuanced perspective of the opposing party, even if they seem like terrible people to you. As always, thanks for watching, and please subscribe.
All right, I kind of stumbled on this guy, and I kind of like his stuff. He talks really fast, but I kind of like some of the ways that he presents that stuff. And what I really found interesting was some of the comparisons that he used, and how what we knew about the Gnostics before discovering the Nag Hammadi is what the way Elaine Pagels pronounces it. The Nag Hammadi Library was really based upon what their enemies, or the people who really hated them, actually described them. And I love the way the analogy that he used about, be like asking a Republican to describe a Democrat, or a Democrat to describe a Republican. You're not going to get a very accurate description of their belief systems at all. So,
Jody,
yeah,
I'm sorry, I've got to go because we have to leave at 4:30 here. But to me, I think we talked last time or at some point about this could be a whole study.
Absolutely.
Study series.
Yes,
So
absolutely.
I want to say before I go, I think that would be very interesting. So just my opinion.
Excellent. And what I really wanted to get back to before you leave is I'll send you the link to the other video that I was going to show you guys, and you guys can watch it on your own if you're interested.
Yeah, the video links and the books that you mentioned.
Sure. The thing that I think we have to get back to is the original question is, how can these, or what do these texts say to us regarding our own faith? And it might be that, you know, when we read these other things, we might find them to be so absurd that we just kind of say, okay, well, this really solidifies what I do believe. And therefore, you know, I can set these things aside. I can say, okay, they exist, and okay, they're you know, I don't think they're evil by any means, but they don't quite fit with my own theology. And so therefore I can just have them on the shelf, and they'll just gather some dust and it'll be okay. The other thing too, though, is to take those and say, okay, well, I wonder, you know, for example, with the Gospel of Judas. Okay, so the Bible tells us that Judas was evil, that he was filled with evil, and he betrayed Jesus, right? But yet in the Gnostic work that is called the Gospel of Judas, there is some question as to whether or not Judas was actually Jesus's partner in the whole thing. And if Jesus actually said to him, you know what, in order for this thing to work, you have to turn me in. You know, that puts Judas in a whole different light. And it's like, okay, well, does that change the way that I feel about Judas? Does that change the way I feel about Jesus? Does it really matter? You know, I just think it really helps to open up our minds a bit.
It also, along with that, in Jesus Christ Superstar, it kind of alludes to that with Judas.
Right.
So,
all right. So when we get done here, thank you for being with us. I'm sorry we went a little bit long.
That's okay.
When we get done
Jody.
here, I will pull all of those resources together and I'll send them to the three of you. So, but before we go, Dana or Judy, do you have any thoughts or questions that you'd like to share?
It's just my technical thing. When you go away with the picture, I couldn't get you back. I did get you back orally so that I can listen, but I don't know why it does that. So
yeah, that's odd. You know,
every time you start a video, it goes away, and then I have trouble getting it back.
So let's, I'm going to mention that to David and ask him to reach out to you and see if you can troubleshoot that.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome. You're on mute, Dana.
I didn't want you to have dog barking.
Oh,
It is some of the studies I did of the Romans' view of the Gothics and Goths and the barbarians. They have statues making them horrible people. And a lot of them were Christian.
yeah.
At cities. And so it's interesting how you have to be aware of who's writing that history.
That's very true. That's very true.
And everybody on the Goths, everybody's running around with the black clothes and the dark. And it's like they were Christian, but they were the Gnostic type Christians. So it's always important to question who's writing the history.
Indeed. And I think that's really, I mean, that's something that I take into consideration when I'm looking at different resources. You know, I've got bookcases full of books here, some of which I bought, you know, thinking I would use them. And then after I start reading them, it's like, well, now wait a minute, this doesn't make sense. Or it gives maybe a negative slant, or it talks about talks about the text or the people in a way that just doesn't mesh with the way that I understand the theology. And so, yeah, you have to be really careful about,
or at least reading various people and not
indeed
not the world according to the Roman Empire.
That's right.